Welcome to another episode of Planet Possible. We are delighted that you're joining us to hear evidence-led discussion about topics that are critical to the way we manage our water, nature and climate. A huge thanks to our sponsors, BMA, Arup and MWH Treatment. And you'll hear a little bit more about them later. We're really grateful for their support in helping us bring the podcast to you. If you're new to Planet Possible, I'm Niki Roach. I am an enthusiastic connector of people and ideas and a fellow of CIWEM, the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. The impacts of climate change are far more severe than most people realise, but the solutions to them are well within our grasp. That's the message of The Response, a story of fire and flood in Britain's new world of extremes by David Shukman. After nearly 20 years leading the BBC's coverage of the environment, David talks to people we rarely hear from in discussions of the climate emergency. Firefighters, water and sanitation experts and physiologists. And above all, he gives voice to victims such as Tony Arancio, describing how he narrowly escaped drowning in a London basement, and sheds light on how complex planning and adapting to more extremes of climate currently is. I found his book a compelling read, and so in today's episode, I am delighted to be joined by David to explore some of the stories he shares and get underneath what motivated him to write it and what he hopes it'll achieve. So a very warm welcome to Planet Possible, David. It's great to have you with us.
Oh, I'm delighted to be invited and really looking forward to this.
So I would love to understand, after a 20 plus year career in broadcasting some of the biggest environmental stories, what made you decide to sit down and write this book?
I was really moved by the idea that, and from my own reading and research, that climate impacts were more severe than many people realise, but the solutions are closer to hand than we realise as well. And I was very guided by the work of a review into the risks of climate change in London, led by the former chair of the Environment Agency, Emma Howard-Boyd. The London Climate Resilience Review looked at all the different things that might threaten the capital. And I was in touch with her and her team. And there was one phone call in particular. I just wanted to fall off my chair. I was stunned to discover the things that they were finding out that I didn't know about. I mean, I knew that there'd been bad flash flooding, surface water flooding in London, for example, or I knew that there'd been some fires on the eastern edge of the city in July 2022, but I hadn't really put all this together in terms of just how vulnerable London is. And I thought, well, hang on, if the capital of one of the richest cities on earth is as vulnerable as seems to be the case, that needs to be amplified, it needs to be broadcast. And that really gave me the motivation to write the book, to try to wake people up actually to the kind of risks we face, but also the many, many ways in which we can make ourselves safer.
And the book is structured around a series of climate impacts, so things like fracking, air pollution, food security, with chapters such as Cruel Summer, tackling the wildfires, as you just mentioned, across much of England in 2022, Deep Breath, which I found really impactful, dealing with the extreme surface water flooding, and the myth of protection, considering storm surges on the East Coast. But what I found really compelling, I think, is that you've taken something that we might hear as climate headlines on the news or as professionals maybe in a report, and you made it really real by bringing to life the stories from those people impacted. So I was interested in if there are any particular stories that really stand out to you that you gathered and maybe stayed with you after writing the book.
Oh, the story of Tony living in a London basement, elderly Italian man, and he's just watching television one lunchtime in July 2021 and suddenly notices water rising around his ankles and then his knees, and it reaches his waist. He can't understand it, and it's not pure water, it's sewage. And what was happening was that there'd been this massive downpour, a convective storm. Very, very hard for the Met Office to provide precise forecasting of where these storms will drop huge amounts of rain. But it turned out that day, this is a pretty rough calculation, that 5 times more rain fell than the London sewage and drainage network could handle. Manhole covers were blown into the air, great geysers of sewage were being blasted into the streets. And all of that water flowing down the streets found its own level. And London, like many older cities, has a lot of people living in basements. And of course that water and sewage and muck poured downhill. And that's what Tony was facing in his flat. And talking to him many times, including visiting him in his home, it was really shocking to see what he went through. In the space of really probably 20 or 30 minutes, he went from calmly living in his flat to thinking he was going to drown because he couldn't open his front door, because the other side of it was a set of steps running up to the street, which had become a kind of cascade pouring from the street level down to his door. He couldn't get out of the front window to a light well that led up to the street because water was pouring in through that window. And then when he went to his bedroom, where there were glass doors leading to a little garden, he could see that the level of the flood was greater on the outside than inside, and the doors opened outwards, so he couldn't open them. And so he described standing with the water rising up to his shoulders and then to his neck. He did this horrible gesture, which really stays with me, of sort of grabbing his throat with a forefinger and thumb and really straining his chin up to describe how he tried to keep alive as the water was rising. And he said he had his arms out like Jesus, his mobile phone in one hand. What he thought was his last act was to ring his sister to say, "Goodbye, I love you." He really thought his number was up. Luckily, a young couple in one of the flats above his, who didn't know him but must have been aware, what about the old guy living in the basement if the streets are flooded? And they came down to the street level, to the garden at the front, and called to him and urged him to make his way to the front window, by which time I think the incoming torrent must have diminished. And somehow he got onto a table and a radiator, he can't remember, and managed to get his head and shoulders out through the window. And the man of the couple somehow got hold of him, made it onto the ground, the front garden, where he survived. And I just think it's kind of outrageous that this could be a situation. You know, I saw almost as a footnote in some of the official reports around the flooding that day, and a very similar downpour and surface water flooding a fortnight later in London. You know, there was a reference to an elderly man nearly drowned, which does not do justice to, I think, the scandal of what happened. Very nearly lost a life in London just because it rained. And that really, for me, has stayed with me.
You've touched a little bit there on the story that you heard from Tony, and I was really struck by others in the book. Lynn Sabaton, who lost her home to fire in Wennington, and Elizabeth Rappaport, who was also impacted by flooding and has gone on to do phenomenal work around sustainable drainage. I suppose, what do you take away personally, David, from some of those conversations?
The country, Britain, is not remotely ready for extremes of weather that we're getting now, let alone those to come. I mean, you mentioned Lynn Sabaton living in Wennington on the edge of London. July the 19th, 2022, we hit 40 degrees. And dozens of large wildfires erupted in a great ring around London. I mean, you think of London burnt by the Great Fire, bombed in the Blitz. It's never before been encircled by dozens of large wildfires. Nearly 40 houses were burnt to the ground in the London area because of wildfires that day. That was the largest loss of British housing to wildfire ever. I mean, something that happens in California, we see on telly, don't we? Australia, Portugal, Greece, urban areas getting burned by fires that start in rural or wild areas. Well, this is what happens if you hit 40 degrees and you're not ready. And it's the same thing with this surface water flooding. If you get increasingly heavy downpours, which we know is a basic physical fact, a body of air that's a degree warmer can hold 7% more moisture. And then you look at the rainfall stats drawn up by brilliant climate scientists. For the last 50, 60 years, the most intense rains have become, in the UK, I think the figure is 15% more intense. And you think, okay, well, that's just basic physics. It's an implication of global warming that actually I never really brought out in my own reporting at the BBC, but now realise is incredibly important. We're not ready for that. Almost every institution involved, whether it's in planning or some sort of aspect of preparation or of response or recovery, actually isn't ready either. It's amazing. The London Fire Brigade weren't ready for this extraordinary number of wildfires in their area. They didn't have the right kit, they didn't have the right equipment or training. They do now, by the way. They've had a wake-up call and commendably are now much better organised and ready for this, recognising that it's a real threat that wasn't expected. But I think what I really want to hope that people get away from the book is, well, hang on, are we ready enough? One of the great problems that was identified that day and didn't come out at the time, and I really tried to pursue, the worst fire, Wennington, eastern edge of London, where 18 houses were burnt. The very first crew on the scene reported to the control room that there's weak pressure in the mains. The one thing you need if you're fighting fires is an abundant supply of water, because the more water you've got, the more aggressive you can be. If you're a bit short of water, you've got to hold back a bit. And that first crew reported that their efforts to fight the fires in those crucial first minutes were hindered by a weak water supply. So I pursued this with these FOIs to the London Fire Brigade and the local water company to try and understand what actually happened. The local water company did tell me, as a result of one of these requests, that they were able to restore the water pressure, or the flow rate, as they put it, at 7 p.m. that evening. Well, the fires started at 1 p.m. For 6 hours, the fire brigade was coping with a less than adequate water supply. And following that incident, the fire brigade, I mean, this is my language, not theirs, but had pretty stiff words with the local water companies in the London area, saying we expect better communication and a quicker response next time this kind of thing happens. And the National Risk Register, that scary compendium of all the bad things that could happen to the UK, does actually list the risk of water scarcity for firefighting at times of drought. So, I laboured to find out who is responsible for making sure the fire and rescue services have enough water to deal with the increasing threat of wildfires burning homes. And I haven't got an answer. I entered a kind of maze of Whitehall departments and ministries and acronyms, and I was passed from pillar to post. DEFRA, the Environment Ministry, is in charge of wildfire policy, but only up to the moment of ignition. When wildfires start, it's obviously fire and rescue services who used to come under the Home Office. Now they come under the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. But when I approached that ministry, weirdly I got an answer from DEFRA, and then I got sent to the Cabinet Office and then to Ofwat, the regulator, but then they said that's not really them. I don't think our governance of this crucial issue is sorted. It's not adequate. I mean, imagine you live in a nice place next door to a field or a park, and then there's a drought, and then it's 40 degrees, and we know we're going to get that again, and a fire starts, and grass fires advance at a decent walking pace, so you haven't got much time to get out. And let's say that a fire advances to your house, and the brilliant local fire and rescue service respond, and they turn up, and they do what they can, but they find they're not getting enough pressure out of the mains, and your house burns. And you think, well, hang on, surely we can do better than that. And again, that's been a motivation for me, I think, all the way through. Surely we can do better in the face of these potential catastrophes. I think we have an opportunity to avoid preventable deaths. Do you know what? I made a discovery, Niki, and you might have known this already. This is public but hard to find, right? The official reasonable worst case scenario for surface water flooding in London is that you get a convective storm, as we had in 2021, huge amount of water drops. The official document assumes potential for over 40 fatalities in a really bad surface water incident in London with 300,000 people evacuated. Now, it would be horrific if in London or another big British city, any city, we had 40 dead because of a massive downpour that couldn't be adequately handled and drained away.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that perhaps the gaps that you're talking about exist because we've never had to test it before, or not for a long time. And so therefore, emergency response is a well-oiled machine for stuff that is regular, tragic but regular. But actually what you're starting to talk about here are the extremes. They're on the boundaries of what we're used to doing, and therefore I mean, I took away, particularly the chapter on wildfires, that complete sort of almost sense of futility in that, you know, the fire brigade were asking for more tenders, more water, and there was nothing more to offer, both in terms of water and more engines, because everyone was deployed everywhere else. And those poor residents are just waiting, you know, just sitting and waiting for the fire to engulf them. And it strikes me that we are on the edges, aren't we, of what we're used to, and therefore perhaps the gaps that you're finding exist because they are genuine gaps at the moment, because we've not had to test those systems at this level before.
That's right. I mean, I think one has to accept as a kind of starting point that conditions are different now. We're experiencing kind of extremes of weather that are genuinely new. I mean, we haven't had 40 degrees before, so we don't know how that plays out. There's a number of ways in which that plays out in really bad ways, exposing weaknesses that are existing and we've got away with if your worst heat wave is 34, 35. Things are different when you get into the high 30s or beyond. With the firefighting, you know, I was appalled to interview a number of firefighters. You know, one of them described they've got standard kit, these flame-proof suits, which are designed to protect you if you do the classic firefighting role of running into, let's say, a burning house with your hoses, and you're there inside in extreme heat and flame for, let's say, 10 minutes. And then you come out and you can cool off because you're out of danger. If you're out in the open in 40 degrees for 8 hours wearing these suits, which have a thick lining, which became sodden with perspiration, it's no surprise that a number of firefighters keeled over from heat. Various forms of heat stress, heat stroke, and needed to come off the line because they were, as one of them said, it's like being a boil-in-the-bag meal when you're wearing these things. Well, now they're trialling lightweight PPE, which fire brigades in hotter countries already much more used to. Lighter weight clothing provides some protection but doesn't have this boil-in-the-bag feature which is so debilitating. But that's just one example. You see this a bit with flooding, where actually how used or prepared is the public for mass evacuation? Because there are some situations where really the only solution to save lives is to get people out of harm's way. Now the forecasting of storm surges on the coast has become way better, and there are plans in place to get people out of harm's way. We know the observation of river levels was way better, and the forecasting around rainfall, so it ought to be possible now to get people out of harm's way from river flooding. But surface water, these downpours that are heavier than we experience, and indeed the wildfires popping up, erupting in unexpected places, no one's ready for that or how to handle it. I was really struck by a couple of things. The Ordnance Survey, that I knew best from my days enjoying hiking, always have an Ordnance Survey map kind of in the rucksack. Ordnance Survey did a study of how many homes in England are within 100 metres of the kind of open land that could conceivably catch fire. They came up with a total of 1.8 million. Now, you could say, well, maybe their modelling's a bit off. Let's halve it. Well, still 900,000. You could say, you know, they're 10 times wrong. You're still dealing with thousands of houses potentially at risk. And I think we need to broadcast this much more, and then also to point out what we can and do about it. Similarly with the idea of how do you get away from a wildfire? Well, there was a terrible wildfire in the town of Mati in Greece in 2018. Very similar kind of structure to the UK. You had fields and forests and parks in this very pretty town, and these fires took hold. People didn't know where to go when they fled from their homes, and the local police didn't know where to send them. And the result was 100 people died in that fire. Talk to firefighters and the small community of wildfire experts in the UK, and they think that's perfectly possible here. Things could really go wrong. So I think we definitely dodged a bullet, but we can get ourselves into a much stronger position if we have the will.
As a global consultancy with extensive technical and advisory expertise, Arup works across the entire water cycle, with utilities, local and regional governments, commercial and domestic water users and partners. From designing and maintaining key water infrastructure services to advising on natural catchments and flood defences, Arup helps its clients consider long-term economic, environmental and social dimensions. Arup, like Planet Possible, is focused on making progress for our climate, water and nature. BMA is a next-gen AI decision intelligence software company. Their cloud-based platform, Decisio, redefines how water and energy companies approach their infrastructure planning to make better, faster and more connected critical decisions, simultaneously achieving net zero, resilience and financial sustainability. I don't know about you, but I've been struck when I've been lucky enough to travel and I've been to places where there's a risk of tsunamis. And it's just par for the course that there are signs that say tsunami evacuation route, and there's a little sign with a big picture of a big wave that's quite obvious and an arrow. And I think the first time I saw that, I was a bit sort of shocked by it. And then actually after a while you think, yeah, I mean, it's extremely low probability, but a very high impact. So I'm glad I know. And that's it. And then it goes away. It's not something you spend a lot of time worrying about, but it's nice to know it's been considered. And I think when I read the book and was reading about the storm surges and the signage or lack thereof on, some of our low-lying areas on the East Coast, it really struck me that I wonder whether we've just tried to minimise this too much in the past. And there is an opportunity now to think about how do you educate people in a calm way, but that's really clear so that this doesn't feel frightening, but it also does feel well managed if there is the need to evacuate, for example.
That's such a good point, and I'm going to give credit to your president, the president of CWEM, John Curtin, who put me onto this thing in Lincolnshire, in low-lying areas, vulnerable to storm surge, protected by, let's face it, not particularly well maintained barriers along the coast. There are these little road signs which just say ER out. They actually stand for evacuation route out. There was a bit of a battle between local emergency planners who wanted to raise the profile of the risks and how a mass evacuation would operate. They brought in consultants who drew on experience from other parts of the world and worked out that the best way to get tens of thousands of people out of harm's way, not in a mad panic, but in an orderly but rapid way, assuming most of them would drive in their own cars, is to have signage. What you don't want is all the roads getting clogged up, and then somebody breaks down, and then some people crash into each other, and then someone has a heart attack, and before you know what you've got a horrible humanitarian situation and gridlock as the waves are approaching the coast. So to avoid that, you have designated routes in for the emergency services and out for the general public, off to safer areas inland. And the proponents of this plan in Lincolnshire County Council wanted the kind of signs you're talking about from tsunami-prone parts of the world, a nice big picture of a wave and very clear language like evacuation route or flood escape route or something. And that all got toned down at various levels, particularly in London, in Whitehall. The Department for Transport came back and said, we're in charge, this is what you're getting, ER out. That reveals a kind of institutional coyness. I mean, we used to fire exit signs show a little figure running for a door, or you're used to, if you catch a flight, images of the procedure for putting a life jacket on or where the emergency exits are. We're not idiots, but for some reason, when it comes to the prospect of saving hundreds of lives from a storm surge or some other catastrophe like that, there's a sort of, I think, suppression, actually, of reality. Oh, no, we mustn't scare people. Well, I think the evidence of the COVID pandemic is if you share with people what you know and what you're uncertain about, actually people get it. If you explain the risks and explain how things might work, and I think in the case of a storm surge, if you're to explain, well, we can pick up from the forecast maybe 5 or 6 days in advance, and that probably gives us a window of, let's say, 48 hours if we think it's really going to be serious. If the tides and the winds are going to be wrong and unhelpful, we might need to get tens of thousands of people out of harm's way. This is how we think it's best to do that. In the main, if you're open and transparent and upfront, we think your life will be at risk unless you do this. We really would appreciate you cooperating. I think that would go down well with a lot of people. But we're in a situation where I'm afraid we're too coy. There's official timidity and shyness. I fear that will cost lives.
So many of the listeners to Planet Possible are professionals working across water, climate, nature and everything from engineering to policy and so on. So what would you want those professionals to hear if you could speak to them directly, David?
I think to bear in mind the human cost, the human risk, the fact that actually as a country we've dodged some bullets. There have been a number of near catastrophes. If these official reasonable worst case scenarios are right for 40 dead in a London surface water flood, if they read the stories I describe of people caught up in these tragedies who've lost homes, who've lost livelihoods, who've taken years to rebuild their lives after these events, if one can think of what's it actually like for a hospital like Whipps Cross Hospital in London, knocked out of action for a couple of days because of surface water flooding. 100 patients had to be evacuated by the London Fire Brigade. At one point they thought they'd have to move 800 patients. I mean, we can do better than this. In my research and talking to more than 100 people in preparation for this book, there are some professionals who really get the need for joined up thinking and joined up working and reaching out beyond their own organisations to others who have a direct bearing. But all too often I see examples where there's a narrowness of vision. Well, that's not really our problem. I mean, you mentioned Elizabeth Rappaport, who chairs Flood Ready London and herself was caught up in a flood in East London in one of these convective storms, who, in addition to trying to knock heads together at a London scale with all the different local authorities and all the different interested parties, and I think has done great work on that, at a local level, and I describe this in the book, trying to improve the sustainable urban drainage in her own area. Not just for herself, obviously, but for that whole community. And finding that, a local authority asked to improve sustainable urban drainage on their territory for the benefit of people in a neighbouring local authority just says, nah, not our problem, in effect. There's this absence of joined up thinking, which I think is incredibly harmful and counterproductive. So I would urge everybody in a professional capacity, obviously you're doing important work in your own field, but I would really love to see more examples of people reaching out more effectively, more consistently, more energetically to say, hang on, we can't solve this alone.
When I read that chapter, I reflected that I don't think I'd ever heard such a clearly articulated take on the challenges of trying to embed sustainable drainage. For listeners that are into this kind of thing, buy the book, read it, and it will make you feel vindicated at some of the frustrations that you have in real life, because I think you've captured it perfectly, which is sometimes it feels like madness, I think, as a practitioner in that space. And it's all through very logical reasons, but unfortunately it's built bottom up. The system is not built in a connected way, and depending on where the water comes from depends then on who's responsible for it and who's responsible for managing it, and it means we get these really fragmented solutions sometimes, I think, don't we?
You're so right, and I keep in mind a line from Elizabeth Rappaport that water doesn't care about a line on a map. That's absolutely right, and I had the idea, which I didn't quite develop in the book, of following a raindrop through numerous jurisdictions, private property into one local authority, into another local authority, into the realm of a privatised water utility, back into private property downstream or whatever. That kind of thinking helped me actually almost try to bring out the tragic absurdity. As you say, we've inherited a system of governance that just isn't right for the conditions we are living in now.
Yeah, and I think not dynamic enough given the dynamism of the climatic extremes. I am really interested in the storytelling element of this book. I think it is some of the most powerful climate storytelling I've read. It's kind of written a bit like a dramatic novel in some respects. And I was reflecting, it made me feel all sorts of things. And we know that feelings are often kind of agents of change, aren't they? So I guess as a professional climate communicator, David, that's what your entire career has been. What do you think we've got right? And what do you think we could do better when it comes to climate communication to the public, to policymakers? I would love to hear some of your reflections on that.
I think one of the great things that we, as a society, have got right is supporting brilliant, diligent climate scientists over generations, going back a century or more, working out how the planet operates and how the burning of fossil fuels raises temperatures and creates this world that we've now got of increasingly intense extremes of heat and flooding and other consequences like fire and impacts on supply chains. That's an amazing scientific achievement, often derided, often not given enough credit, and obviously dismissed by the likes of Donald Trump and others. But this is an amazing, I would argue, civilizational achievement. At the same time, I think the communication of that work has sort of gone down maybe an unhelpful track, because necessarily it involves a lot of terminology, a lot of concepts, a lot of language that can be alienating and off-putting. I think if you say to someone, well, we've got to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 in order to reduce the risk of the global average temperature shooting past 1.5, that makes sense, I'm sure, to your listeners who are professionals, but I'd argue for most of the population it's gobbledygook. Whereas if you say, your house might become uninsurable against flooding, your daughter's asthma, it's made worse by traffic pollution, brought to you courtesy of some very, very large corporations that have a vested interest in maintaining the sale of oil and gas and other fossil fuels. The heat waves that make your commute on a train or the tube in London unendurable, or that disrupted railway tracks or shut your kid's school because it doesn't have air conditioning. That's becoming more frequent and more intense because of this thing you might have heard about global warming. I think you get a different reaction. So for me, it's about, wherever possible, any communication with the public, with schools, with students, wherever you're speaking beyond your bubble, I think it's critically important to make this less about global warming and to make it more personal, to bring it right down to the individual level. So it's about you, your day, your family. Can you get to work? What's it like at your work? What's it like for your home? We know from the recent heat wave, a lot of homes become almost uninhabitable. Heat rises, bedrooms, people can't sleep, they can't ventilate them properly. No one in Britain has external shutters, which are normal in hotter countries to keep the heat off the glass. I think that ought to become a norm. Very few places have air conditioning unless they're public spaces. So I think it's about trying to bring everything down to a level of a home or a family or an individual. And I think the more we do that, the more this subject will resonate. Not with everybody, but I think with more people than we've had in the past. Can you just talk in everyday terms? The messaging of all of this will make more sense for people.
If I could be bold enough to add something, I think then people start to say, so what can I do about it? And that's, I think, what we want to catalyse, isn't it? Is people realising they can be empowered to take action themselves if they're able to, at property level or in the choices that they make in life. It's getting people to realise you can do something. And there's a hopefulness, I think, in the book that makes that point, really, which is this is not some inevitable doom spiral that we're on and tough, really. It's a sort of, some of this is going to happen, acknowledging the kind of brutal facts of that, but then also recognising so we can do something about it at individual level, at community level, at societal level.
It's so important that you've raised that, Niki, and I think it's incredibly valuable. We do have agency in this. We don't have to just sort of blithely sleepwalk into progressively greater disasters. Just for example, wildfires. The wildfire in 2022 that burnt 14 homes in Dagenham was a horrible shock, obviously, to those people and to the local authority and to the fire brigade. And you'll be glad to know that since then, the local authority has just followed the advice of the fire brigade, and where there's open land, playing fields or parks running up to housing, they've cut fire breaks. Just basically, it's not even a word that's particularly well known in the UK context, but it's just a wide strip of closely cut grass. And if there's dead undergrowth, that gets cut as well. And, it worked last summer. There was a wildfire on some playing fields in Dagenham, directly threatening houses. The flames did not cross the fire break. That's just a wonderful example of what we can do. I think in the context of flooding, there's a lot of discussion now, but I think it needs to be given rocket boosters of property level flood resilience. I think it's a way of helping people understand that there are things that they can do to either reduce the risk of being flooded or reduce the impact of a flood. Floodproof doors, whether it's automatically closing air bricks, whether it's thinking about moving precious objects up out of maybe the lowest floor wherever you live. Organising yourself with a grab bag. So if you have to get out in a hurry, you've got a bag with spare clothing and whatever else you need. I think this kind of thinking, if it can be encouraged, and by the way, I think, and I write about this in the book, I think the insurance industry could play a much bigger and more constructive role in encouraging this. I tell the story in the book of a couple in Boulder County, Colorado, at risk of wildfire, being told by their insurers, we're not going to cover you unless you carry out the following list of measures to reduce your risk to wildfire. In a very grumbling way, they eventually agreed and did this, which meant basically cutting back on vegetation. And sure enough, a few months later, a wildfire tore through their valley and burnt a number of houses. Their neighbours didn't burn theirs. And I think that's a great example of insurance companies being proactive in a really positive way, encouraging people to do a bit of looking after themselves in order to maintain coverage. And I think the more that could happen with flooding, for example, in the UK context, the better. But I think there's a great deal of hope about that.
MWH Treatment is one of the UK's leading water and wastewater process contractors. MWH offers a truly integrated design and build service that's uniquely dedicated to the water industry. With an innovative and future-facing approach, everything MWH does is guided by its purpose to shape a better world. Right, final question, David. I could talk to you all day, but I ask all my guests this. I'm going to pass you the now famous Planet Possible magic wand. Give it a wave. You can make anything possible in this space. Tell me what you want.
I think it's going to be quite boring, actually. It's quite institutional, but I think it's a sudden awakening across Whitehall and all its different departments and ministries and across local authorities and all of the emergency services who are bearing the brunt of worsening climate impacts, that actually if everyone's better coordinated and better funded, and that comes from central government, and if politicians make the case that if we spend now relatively, what sound like big sums, but in the context of the coming decade, relatively small, it's going to really pay off. It's going to save lives, it's going to save businesses, it's going to save properties, and whether it's wildfire risk or flooding or heat, I would love to see, as it were, a great awakening, that this is worth doing. It's the equivalent of that amazing awakening in Victorian times when there was the great stink of London, and suddenly the government said, fine, we've got to spend the money and improve London's sewage system. And the city flourished and benefited from that, and waves of cholera ended in the city as a result. And I think we're at that same moment. I would love the magic wand to say, yeah, now is the moment. We have a chance. Let's do it.
I love that. I'm here for it. I feel like it's planting trees that you may never see reach full height, but that's the point, isn't it, really?
Other generations will benefit.
David, time's flown by and we're at the end of another episode, but I hope it's given you something to think about in your world, and I hope it's given you another book to read as well. If you don't already, then subscribe to Planet Possible on your podcast app. We'll magically appear in your feed. For our next episode, we are exploring water in transition and what the future looks like when water might need to be more manufactured than we're used to. So I'm joined by Karma Loveday, editor of the UK Water Report, and Adam Lovell from the Australian Water Association. Until then, all that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to our sponsors, BMA, Arup and MWH Treatment, and my wonderful guest, David Shukman. Thank you, David.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
That's it, everyone. And until next time, stay curious, look for connections, and explore what's possible.